I still can't shake the feeling that something's watching me. It happened during that camping trip last summer, deep in the woods of the Appalachian Mountains, the kind of place where the trees are so dense the sunlight barely touches the ground. My friends and I were looking for an escape from our busy lives. No phones, no work, just nature. But I soon learned that the woods have their own dark side. It started out like any other camping trip. The day was clear, the sky was a bright blue, and the air smelled like pine. We set up our tents in a small clearing near a creek, a place that felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. We joked around, cooked some food over the fire, and told stories about ghosts and monsters. But then, as night began to fall, things started to get strange. We were sitting around the fire, laughing and talking when I first heard it. A rustling noise, not from the wind or animals, but something more deliberate. It was coming from the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I turned to my friends, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, but they hadn't heard it. Probably just a deer, one of them said, trying to reassure me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. There was something out there, something watching us. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the isolation was messing with my mind. So I tried to put it out of my head. We finished our food, shared more stories, and eventually the fire died down to nothing but embers. That's when things got worse. I went to my tent first, hoping that some sleep would calm my nerves. I lay there, staring up at the canvas, trying to ignore the sounds of the night. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of the wind in the trees, all of it was familiar, comforting even. But then I heard it again, the rustling, closer this time. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just a raccoon or some other animal, but the sound didn't stop. It was like something was moving around the perimeter of our campsite, slow and deliberate. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard the faintest sound of breathing. Shallow, labored breaths, not from an animal. This was something else. I had to get out of the tent. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully unzipped the entrance, stepping outside as quietly as I could. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees in eerie, sharp angles. I scanned the woods, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see. I told myself it was just my imagination, but that breath, that horrible, raspy breath, couldn't have been anything normal. I walked back to the campfire, hoping my friends were still awake, but the fire was almost out. I could barely see anything now. My friends were asleep in their tents, and I was alone. That's when I heard the whisper. It was soft, almost like it was right behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. "Get out," the whisper said. "Get out now." I froze. My blood turned to ice. The voice was unmistakably human, but it didn't sound right. It was low, almost guttural, like it was coming from someone who had been in the woods too long. Panic flooded my chest. I sprinted to my friend's tent, shaking them awake. "We need to leave," I whispered frantically. They groggily told me I was overreacting, but I couldn't explain it. It wasn't just fear. It was a sense of absolute danger. Something was in those woods, and I was certain it was coming for us. We packed up quickly, each of us on edge, not knowing if we were being paranoid or if something really was out there. But when we started walking back to the trailhead, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The woods felt alive, and not in a good way. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches creaking in the wind, and in the distance I thought I saw movement, shapes shifting in the shadows. My friends were just as nervous as I was, but we didn't talk much. We kept walking. Our footsteps the only sound in the otherwise silent forest. That's when I heard the rustling again, closer than ever before. I froze in my tracks. It wasn't just a sound. There were footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following us. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. But they didn't respond. They didn't hear it. And when I looked back at them, I saw that they were walking too fast, too calmly, like they couldn't hear the footsteps. They couldn't hear the breathing. They didn't see the dark shapes following us. And then it hit me. The thing in the woods wasn't just following us, it was mimicking us. I turned around quickly, shining my flashlight in every direction, but I saw nothing. I began to walk faster, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were still there, matching mine in perfect rhythm. No matter how fast I walked, they kept up with me. Suddenly, one of my friends stopped. He looked over his shoulder, eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is that?" he asked, his voice trembling. I turned to look, and there, standing at the edge of the trees, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its face was obscured by a dark hood. But what caught my attention most was its arms. They were long, too long, and its fingers were twisted, like they didn't belong to a human at all. "Run!" I shouted, and without thinking, I bolted through the woods. My friends followed, but I could hear it behind us, moving quickly, impossibly fast. The trees seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the brush of branches against my face. I stumbled, but I didn't stop. I could hear the heavy breathing again, closer, louder. Something was right behind me, just a few feet away. I was sure of it. We finally reached the trailhead, the light of the parking lot visible in the distance. We ran the last stretch, not daring to look back, and when we burst out onto the paved road, the footsteps stopped. The breathing stopped. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. I could barely get my breath, my heart racing so fast I thought it might explode. We all piled into the car, locking the doors. No one said anything for a while. We didn't need to. We knew what had happened. Something had been out there watching us. Something not entirely human. Something that could mimic the sounds of the woods, the sounds of our own footsteps. We didn't know what it was or why it had followed us, but we were sure of one thing. We'd never set foot in those woods again. The worst part is that even now, I can still hear it sometimes. That breath. That horrible, raspy breath, like something is still out there waiting for me to return.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a typical camping trip. Just me and a couple of friends heading deep into the woods to get away from the grind of everyday life. We weren't looking for anything strange or out of the ordinary, but what we found that weekend, I still can't explain. It's been years now, but I'm telling you, what happened in those woods was something I'll never forget. Something that still haunts me to this day. It all started like any other camping trip. We packed up the car and drove out to this remote spot we found online. The reviews mentioned it was quiet, secluded, and the perfect place to get away from the noise. As we unloaded our gear and set up camp, everything felt fine. We joked around, made some s'mores, and talked about random things like the weird history of the forest we were in. I remember one of my friends, David, telling us that the woods had been used for logging decades ago. There were rumors about it being haunted, but honestly, we didn't give it much thought. Ghost stories are just that, stories, right? That night, after a couple of beers and a lot of laughter, we all turned in for bed. The tent was cozy enough and I fell asleep quickly. But around 2 a.m., something woke me up. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not the usual rustling of animals in the forest, but heavy, deliberate steps, like someone walking around our campsite. I froze, holding my breath, listening to the sound. I tried to wake David, but he was dead asleep. I didn't want to get up and check for myself, so I just lay there, straining my ears. The footsteps stopped for a while, but then came back, closer this time. It felt like someone was pacing around our tent, circling it. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what it was. Slowly, I unzipped the tent flap, peeking out. The moonlight barely cut through the thick trees, but I could just make out a figure, standing there, motionless, just outside the light's reach. I couldn't see their face, but I knew someone was there. My heart slammed in my chest as I quickly zipped the tent back up, whispering to David to wake up. "What's going on?" he mumbled, groggy. "Someone's out there," I whispered, my voice shaking. David didn't seem too concerned. "It's probably an animal, dude. Go back to sleep." I couldn't sleep after that. I spent the rest of the night staring at the walls of the tent, my mind racing. Every little sound had me jumping. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the trees, I felt a little better. It was day now, and daylight has a way of making everything feel safer, even in the middle of the woods. We had breakfast and went for a hike around the area, trying to shake off the weird feeling from the night before. But that didn't work. Every step we took, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was like someone or something was watching us. The others seemed oblivious. David and our other friends, Sarah and Mark, were talking about their plans for the evening, maybe fishing or having another bonfire. I just kept looking over my shoulder, convinced something was out there. That evening, things took another strange turn. We decided to go down to the lake to fish, and as we walked along the trail to get there, we saw something strange. Fresh, deep footprints in the dirt. They were huge, much bigger than anything human, and they were in a straight line leading right into the woods, but there was no sign of where they came from. No other prints on either side. Just these deep, heavy tracks as if someone or something had been walking right through the forest without any concern for leaving a trail. David laughed it off. Probably some guy hiking around in boots. No big deal. I didn't think so. There was something unsettling about them, the way they just stopped. We walked a little further, and that's when we found something else. It was a small clearing, but the trees around it had been cut down. The stumps were old, the wood long rotted away. In the center of the clearing was a large rock, and someone had carved something into it. Scratches, symbols, strange markings that I didn't recognize. We all stood there in silence for a moment, unsure of what we were looking at. Sarah, trying to break the tension, laughed nervously. This is like some creepy horror movie. I didn't think it was funny. Something about the place didn't sit right with me. It felt ancient, like the kind of place where bad things had happened. I suggested we leave, but David and Mark were all for sticking around. They thought it was just some weird thing left by other campers. But I couldn't shake the sense that we had stumbled into something dangerous, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. Night came quickly, and we made our way back to camp. The air grew colder, and the trees creaked in the wind. We sat by the fire, trying to keep things lighthearted, but I noticed David kept glancing toward the woods, like he was expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. The feeling of being watched only intensified as the firelight flickered. Around midnight, it happened again, the footsteps. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just one set of steps, it was multiple. The sound was louder now, echoing around us, as if someone or something was circling our camp. I looked at the others, but none of them seemed to notice. It was like I was the only one hearing it. David finally stood up and said, "All right, that's it. I'm checking this out." He grabbed a flashlight and walked into the woods, calling out into the darkness. "Hello? Who's out there?" I tried to stop him, but he was already too far in. I don't know why I didn't follow him, but I couldn't. Something told me it wasn't a good idea. But then the flashlight flickered and went out. The silence that followed was deafening. "David?" I called into the darkness. There was no answer. I waited for what felt like hours, but it couldn't have been more than a few minutes before David reappeared, looking pale, his eyes wide with fear. "David, what happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer at first, just stood there, breathing heavily. Finally, he whispered, There's something in the woods. Something? I don't know. I saw it." "What did you see?" I pressed. David's face contorted as he struggled to find the words. It was like a shadow moving between the trees. But it wasn't an animal. It was human, but wrong, twisted. I couldn't see its face. That's when I felt it, a presence, standing behind me. I turned around, and for just a split second, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, standing just at the edge of the campfire's light. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed red, burning into me. I don't know how to explain it, but in that moment I knew it wasn't human. It couldn't be. I grabbed David and pulled him toward the tent, urging everyone to get inside. I didn't know what was out there, but it was something we shouldn't have disturbed. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the tent, not speaking, too afraid to move. We didn't sleep. We didn't even breathe too loudly, afraid that if we did, whatever was in those woods would find us. The next morning, we packed up in silence. No one said anything about what happened the night before. No one mentioned the figure in the woods or the footsteps that circled our camp. We just wanted to leave as fast as possible. When we finally got back to the car, I glanced back at the woods one last time. I swear I saw something watching us from between the trees. Something that wasn't human. I never went camping again after that. Not in those woods, not anywhere else. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I know this much. It wasn't alone, and it wasn't finished with us.
Next story.
I don't know why we thought it would be a good idea to go camping alone in the woods for the weekend. The plan was simple. Just a few friends, a quiet forest, and some time away from the chaos of the world. We were young, eager to escape the noise of our everyday lives, and had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. It was supposed to be a retreat, a break from work, school, and all the usual stress. But as soon as we arrived, I could tell something was off. The woods around us were thick, dark, and unwelcoming. The trees were old and twisted, like something out of a nightmare. But my friends, Jake, Amy, and Lucas, were excited, unpacking the car and setting up the tents, completely oblivious to the strange feeling I had. We didn't pick this spot on a whim. Jake had been here before and promised it was the perfect getaway, a peaceful spot near a small lake just far enough from the nearest trailhead to avoid other campers. It seemed ideal until it didn't. We set up camp, built a fire, and started to unwind as the sun set. The air grew cooler, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I sat on a log near the fire, trying to shake off the unease that had settled deep in my gut. The others were talking, laughing, and making plans for a hike the next day. I wanted to join them, but I couldn't ignore the sense that we weren't alone. Around midnight, when we were all sitting by the fire, I noticed something strange. There was a faint sound in the distance, a slow, rhythmic thudding, like something large and heavy was moving through the woods. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a bear or some deer. But as the sound grew louder, I could tell it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something deliberate. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Amy glanced over at me, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all fell silent, listening. The sound was unmistakable now. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something following us. "What do you think it is?" Lucas asked, his voice tight with tension. Before anyone could answer, the sound stopped, abruptly. I thought that maybe it had just been an animal, but the air felt different now, thicker, heavier. I looked around, trying to peer into the darkness between the trees, but it was too black to see anything. Then, without warning, the fire flickered. The flames twisted unnaturally, like they were being blown by an invisible wind, even though the air around us was still. I could feel my heart racing, my hands clammy. Something wasn't right. "I think we should head to bed," Jake said, standing up. "We're just spooking ourselves." We all reluctantly agreed, though none of us seemed eager to sleep. But we crawled into our tents, one by one. I was the last to get in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. I zipped the tent shut, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in my stomach. The noises from outside had stopped, but it felt as though the woods had gone completely still. It was as if the world around us had stopped moving. I tried to sleep, but it felt like hours passed before I finally drifted off. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a soft rustling outside my tent. I froze, straining my ears. The sound was too deliberate to be an animal. Someone or something was walking around the camp. I held my breath, not daring to make a sound. The rustling grew louder, closer. Then it stopped right outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't even move. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, and then I heard a voice. A whisper just outside the tent. Low, soft, but unmistakably human. "Help me." It was a woman's voice. It was faint, but I could hear the desperation in it. I pressed my back against the wall of the tent, too terrified to move, too terrified to call out. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the voice stopped. There was nothing but silence again. But this time, it was worse, because I could feel it. Someone, or something, was right there, standing on the other side of the thin fabric. I don't know how long I stayed there, had paralyzed with fear. But finally, the sounds outside faded away, and the pressure lifted. I didn't know if the danger had passed or if I was just too scared to feel it anymore. I lay there in the dark, my thoughts racing. The next morning, the others were still asleep. I wanted to tell them what happened, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing, I thought. After all, it was just a whisper, a figment of my overactive imagination, right? But then I noticed something, a faint trail of footprints leading away from my tent. They weren't mine. And they weren't from any animal I recognized. The footprints were human-sized, but there was something off about them. They didn't look natural, the way someone would walk through the dirt. They were uneven, jagged, almost as if the person, if it was a person, had been dragging their feet. I didn't say anything to the others. They were already starting to pack up the camp for the hike. but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, that we had stumbled onto something that had been waiting for us. It felt like the woods were alive, breathing around us. We went on our hike, but the further we went into the forest, the more I felt like we were being watched. The trees seemed to close in, their shadows growing longer, darker. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, figures darting between the trunks. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or animals, but deep down, I knew it was something else, something far worse. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was beginning to set again, and I could feel the darkness creeping back over the woods. We gathered around the fire, trying to laugh it off, but none of us felt at ease. We had all seen things we couldn't explain, heard things we couldn't understand. It wasn't long before the rustling started again, but this time it wasn't just one noise. It was many. The forest seemed to come alive around us, footsteps, whispers, the sound of something moving, stalking us through the trees. It felt like we were surrounded, like something was drawing closer, something that knew we didn't belong there. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. Jake, Amy, and Lucas all turned to me, their faces pale and wide-eyed. "You heard it too?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We all nodded. Without a word, we grabbed our things and ran, not daring to look back. When we made it to the car, we didn't stop. We didn't look for our bags or tents or anything else we left behind. We just drove and drove until the feeling of being watched finally began to fade. I've never gone camping since that night. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, but whatever it wasn't something I ever want to face again. The memories of that weekend still haunt me, and every time I'm out in the woods, I feel like something is watching me from the shadows. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was is still out there, waiting, watching.
Next story.
We never should have gone. I know that now, deep in my bones. But at the time, we thought we were just having a little adventure. My friends and I were the type to enjoy getting into mischief. The type who scoffed at warning signs and brushed off the stories about haunted places. The place we chose to camp was an old, forgotten patch of forest known for its eerie reputation. But we didn't care about that. We were looking for a thrill, not believing in superstition. We found the site in a remote corner of the woods, surrounded by tall, ancient trees whose branches seemed to sway without the wind. There was a long-abandoned cabin nearby, half sunken into the ground, and a rusted old fence that had been overtaken by vines and moss. It looked like the kind of place where, if you listened closely enough, you could hear the echoes of history, but we only thought it was creepy in the most cliché way, like something out of a horror movie. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Matt, his girlfriend Kelly, and our buddy Jonah. We'd been planning the trip for weeks, ignoring the warnings of locals who told us to stay away from the old woods. "Things happen out there," they'd said, but we laughed it off. Nothing scares us, we thought. The hike in was difficult. The path was overgrown with thick branches and uneven ground, making every step feel uncertain. But we were determined. By the time we made it to the clearing where we set up camp, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. We had to move quickly to get the fire started, and the tents up before dark fell completely. But as the night came on, a strange chill settled in. I remember it clearly. After dinner, when we were gathered around the fire, something felt wrong. The wind had died down, and the silence in the woods was almost unbearable. There were no animals, no birds, not even the rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Jonah said, breaking the silence. His voice was light, but his eyes darted nervously around the clearing. Matt scoffed. "You're just trying to scare us, dude. It's just the creepy vibe of the place." But even Matt seemed uneasy. He kept shifting his gaze into the woods, squinting as if trying to see something just beyond the reach of the firelight. I didn't know it then, but that's when the first thing happened, the first thing I couldn't explain. We all heard it at the same time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the woods. We froze, our eyes locking on one another. The sound wasn't like any animal. It was too steady, too deliberate. Someone or something was walking toward us. "Hello?" Kelly called out nervously, standing up and looking into the dark woods. "Who's there?" No response, just the sound of footsteps getting closer. We all stood up in unison, tension building in the air. I wanted to call out too, but my throat felt dry. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. Just a shape, a silhouette standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness. Before anyone could say anything, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods, blending seamlessly with the shadows. I don't know who moved first, but we all rushed to the tents. The air was heavy with panic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We huddled in our tents trying to sleep, but none of us could. We kept hearing strange noises outside, things that sounded like they were circling our camp. The occasional twig snapping, the rustling of leaves. But no matter how many times we unzipped the flaps and looked outside, there was nothing. Just the inky blackness of the woods. At some point in the early morning, the sounds stopped. The silence was almost suffocating. But none of us slept. We stayed awake, too afraid to drift off, listening for the slightest sound that might give us a reason to run. The next morning, we packed up camp early. We didn't say much as we broke down the tents, but I could see the fear in their eyes. No one wanted to stay, but none of us wanted to be the first to admit it. As we made our way back toward the path, we passed the abandoned cabin. It loomed there, half buried in the earth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, judging us, like it knew we were trespassing on its land. That's when we saw it. There, in the dirt near the cabin, was a large, deep footprint. It was humanoid, but it didn't look like anything I'd ever seen. The toes were elongated, and the foot itself was far too wide. The print was fresh, still soft at the edges, but no one else seemed to notice it. They were all focused on getting out of there as fast as possible. We hiked out of the woods in tense silence. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced someone or something was following us. But the deeper we went into the forest, the more the feeling of being watched faded. By the time we made it back to the car, I thought I could breathe again. But that night, when I got home, something was different. I thought I heard someone knocking at my door. It was faint, barely audible, but when I opened it, no one was there. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to exhaustion, but the next night, it happened again. The knocking. This time, it wasn't just at the door. It came from the windows, from the walls, from the floor beneath my feet. I stayed up, my heart racing, watching the shadows in my room stretch and shift. I swear I saw something standing in the corner, something that wasn't there when I looked away. It had no face, just a shadowy shape that seemed to stretch with the darkness. I ran to the window, ripped open the blinds, but there was nothing there. No one. Nothing. But the knocking continued. It was incessant, rhythmic, like someone or something was trying to get inside. It went on for hours until I couldn't take it anymore. I called Matt, but when he picked up, all I could hear was his breath, ragged and fearful. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was scared too. "Matt?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "You heard it too, didn't you?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then quietly he answered, "We're all hearing it. And we're all seeing things. Something followed us back. And it's not just at your place. It's been at mine too." I don't know how long I stayed up that night, staring at the walls, listening to the knocking, the scratching, the slow, deliberate movements just outside. But that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is that it hasn't stopped. Every night since that camping trip, the knocking has come. It's not always the same, not always in the same place, but it's always there. And sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I hear something else. A low whisper, too faint to understand, but it's there. It's always there, coming from the corner of my room. I don't know who or what followed us out of those woods, but I know one thing. It's not done with us, and I don't think it will ever let us go.
Next story.
I didn't believe in ghosts, at least not until that night. It started like any other road trip. My friends and I had been driving for hours, making our way through the back roads of a remote part of the country, heading toward a small, unknown town. We were on our way to visit an old friend who had recently moved to a house just outside of town. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, catching up, enjoying some time away from work and school. But something went terribly wrong, something that still haunts me to this day. We were driving along a particularly winding stretch of road when we noticed the sign for a nearby town, but it was faded, barely legible. My friend, Rachel, who had been navigating for us, glanced down at her phone and frowned. The GPS says we should have passed the turnoff for the house about 10 minutes ago. Are we lost? We all turned to look at her, but she didn't seem worried. Still, something felt off. I looked out the window. The trees on either side of the road were thick, pressing in like the woods were closing in on us. The air had a strange heaviness to it, and the sky above was a muted gray. It felt like we had entered some forgotten corner of the world. After another few minutes of driving, Rachel checked her phone again. Okay, this is weird. I don't see anything ahead. No more roads on this map. We should have seen the town by now. Maybe we should turn around, suggested Max, the more cautious one in the group. But when I turned to look out the back window, the road behind us was gone. There was nothing but trees and fog. Before anyone could speak, we all saw it. A small, dilapidated house standing just off the side of the road, its windows dark and its porch sagging. It looked abandoned. Its roof was covered in moss, and the yard was overgrown with weeds like no one had cared for it in years. "Do you think we should check it out?" asked Rachel, her voice hesitant but intrigued. I could tell she was drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. The rest of us exchanged looks, and though we all had that uneasy feeling gnawing at us, we were curious. Maybe this was some hidden treasure, a forgotten piece of history. We decided to pull over. We got out of the car, the cool air making me shiver. The house was eerily quiet, and the faint sound of rustling leaves was the only noise we could hear. The ground around it was muddy, but we carefully walked toward the porch, unsure of what we might find. Rachel was the first to step up onto the porch. The wooden boards creaked under her weight, and the door was slightly ajar as though it had been left open for us. She knocked, but there was no answer. It wasn't like there were any lights on inside. No one had been there for years, it seemed. But then, we heard it. A faint, whispering sound coming from within the house. At first I thought it was just the wind, but as the minutes passed, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like voices, more than one, murmuring in a language I didn't understand. "Do you hear that?" Max asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I replied, my stomach tightening. It wasn't just the wind. There was something in that house. Suddenly, Rachel pushed the door open all the way. She stepped inside without a word, and the rest of us followed her, reluctantly. The air inside the house was thick, musty, and smelled of mold and decay. Dust hung thickly in the air, and the floor creaked under our feet. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, and in the dim light, everything seemed to shimmer with an unsettling, otherworldly glow. The whispering stopped the moment we entered, replaced by an eerie silence. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and I shivered involuntarily. We moved deeper into the house, the floorboards groaning beneath us. We reached a hallway that led to a small room at the end. The door was cracked open, and inside there was an old wooden rocking chair, swaying back and forth, as if it had been recently used. "Who's been here?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. She took a step closer to the room. Then it happened. The rocking chair stopped, and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a woman. She was tall, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes dark and hollow. Her hair hung around her face in long, tangled strands. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, the fabric torn and stained with something dark. She didn't move. She just stood there, staring at us, her lips curling into a slow, twisted smile. "Who are you?" Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. The woman didn't respond. Instead, her head tilted to the side, and I noticed something strange. She had no pupils, just empty, hollow sockets, staring right through us. Max took a step back, his eyes wide with fear. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice breaking. But when he turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic set in. We rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself was holding us captive. The whispering returned, louder than before, now accompanied by scratching sounds like something was clawing at the walls. "Why won't the door open?" Rachel cried, pulling at the handle. The woman in the doorway started to move, her head jerking unnaturally as she walked toward us, her eyes never leaving our faces. "Leave. Now," she hissed in a voice that was like dry leaves scraping against stone. Then we heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the hallway. More figures. More people. All of them as pale and twisted as the woman, their eyes hollow and their expressions twisted with malice. The walls started to bleed. Thin, dark streams of liquid poured down from the cracks, dripping onto the floor. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, and the temperature dropped to freezing. Our breaths came out in clouds of mist, but it wasn't the cold that terrified me. It was the growing feeling that we weren't alone anymore. "Get out! Get out now!" the woman screamed, her voice becoming shrill. In a blind panic, we managed to break the door open, but as we turned to run, the figures closed in around us, their hands reaching out. I don't remember much after that, just the sound of our footsteps pounding against the floor as we ran for our lives, the whispers following us, getting louder and more frantic. We didn't stop running until we were back at the car, the woman's shrill scream echoing in our minds. The town was still nowhere to be seen, but somehow we found our way back to the road. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house was gone, but I'll never forget the sound of that woman's voice, the empty, hollow eyes of the figures, or the feeling of being trapped in a place that never wanted us to leave.
Next story.
It was supposed to be a normal weekend getaway. Just me and my little brother, Jake. Our parents had gone away for the weekend to visit family, and I was tasked with looking after him. Jake and I had always been close, despite the age gap. I was 18 and he was 12, but we shared a lot of the same interests: movies, video games, and just hanging out. When I suggested we go camping for the weekend, just the two of us, he was all for it. We packed up the car with all the essentials: sleeping bags, a tent, food, and drinks, and headed to a remote spot by a lake that our family had camped at years ago. The location wasn't far from home, but it felt isolated enough that it was perfect for getting away from everything. There was no one else there when we arrived. The weather was beautiful, and the lake was calm, reflecting the clear blue sky above. We set up camp near the water, unpacked, and started a fire as the sun began to set. I remember Jake getting excited about roasting marshmallows and telling me stories about school. It felt like a perfect night, peaceful, quiet, and serene. But there was something about the place that felt off. It was hard to put my finger on it, but it felt like the woods around us were watching, waiting. As the darkness crept in, we ate our food, laughed, and talked around the fire. There were no other campers around, no animals, just the occasional rustle of the trees in the light breeze. At some point, Jake excused himself to use the bathroom. The small wooden outhouse was a little further down the path, but he'd walked there 100 times before when we were younger. "Be quick, Jake," I called out, keeping an eye on the fire. "It's getting late." "I'll be back in a minute," he yelled back, disappearing into the dark. A few minutes passed, then 10, then 15. I glanced at my watch. That wasn't like him. He'd never taken this long to use the bathroom. I stood up, a little uneasy, and called out into the night. "Jake, you okay?" No answer. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way toward the outhouse. The path wasn't long, but as I walked, the woods felt heavier, darker. The trees loomed closer, the shadows deeper. The silence was unnerving. No sounds of insects, no chirping birds. It was like everything had stopped moving. When I got to the outhouse, the door was slightly ajar, and the smell of the woods hit me, the earthy, damp smell that only comes after sunset. I pushed the door open and froze. There was no sign of Jake. "Jake?" I called out, my voice shaky. I stepped inside and scanned the small wooden space. The toilet seat was down, and there was no one in sight. My pulse quickened. I could hear my Brecco in the tiny room. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I wasn't sure if it was real. "Help me." My blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was Jake. I dashed out of the outhouse, my mind racing, and I yelled his name. But no answer came. I ran down the path toward the campsite, but as I reached the edge of the trees, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Jake. But something was wrong. He wasn't moving. "Jake," I called out again, cautiously. He didn't respond. His back was to me, and he stood perfectly still, staring at the ground. I took a few hesitant steps forward, trying to make sense of what was going on. "Jake, come on, this isn't funny. What's going on?" Slowly, he turned his head toward me. His eyes were wide, his pupils dilated as if he were in a trance. A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Jake?" I whispered, taking another step closer. Then, in a voice I barely recognized, he said, "Don't come any closer, Anna." I stopped. His voice sounded wrong, distorted, almost like it was being muffled. My name felt foreign coming from his lips. "Jake, what's happening?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. He stepped backward, his feet dragging, as if he wasn't in control of his movements. "They're coming." "Who?" I demanded. "Who's coming?" Suddenly, a strange noise echoed from the woods, like a low growl, a guttural, bone-chilling sound. My heart raced in my chest. I had no idea what it was, but it wasn't anything natural. It wasn't an animal. Jake didn't answer. He just kept backing away from me, eyes fixed on the woods, his face blank. His hand reached out as though trying to hold on to something invisible. Then, without warning, he turned and sprinted into the trees. "Jake!" I screamed. He didn't stop. He just kept running, faster than I had ever seen him run. I was frozen in place, too terrified to move. I couldn't let him go alone. Not like this. I grabbed the flashlight from my pocket and ran after him, calling his name, but the woods seemed to close in on me, the trees twisting and shifting as if trying to block my way. The light from my flashlight barely cut through the thick darkness. I could hear Jake's footsteps ahead of me, but they weren't steady. They were frantic, erratic. I followed the sound of his running, pushing through branches, tripping over roots, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard him. His voice, but it wasn't right. "Anna," he whispered, and I stopped in my tracks. It was coming from all around me, from the trees, from the shadows. The voice was distorted, like 1,000 whispers overlapping. "Anna, help me. They're here." I turned in circles, my flashlight beam cutting through the trees in a wild arc. That's when I saw them. Figures, shapes, impossible to make out clearly, moving in the shadows between the trees. They were tall, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces hidden in darkness, and their eyes, pale, empty eyes, gleamed in the moonlight, fixed on me. "Anna," Jake's voice again, but it didn't come from him. It came from behind me. It was everywhere. "Anna, they won't let me go." I spun around and there was Jake, his body but not his eyes. His face was twisted, his expression slack, as if his soul was no longer his own. "Jake!" I screamed, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, his body swaying slightly. Then one of the figures moved closer to me, and I felt a cold breath on my neck. I turned and ran as fast as I could, but the figures seemed to be everywhere, surrounding me, their whispers growing louder, their presence suffocating. When I reached the campsite, I found my brother lying on the ground, his body limp. His eyes were wide, staring up at the stars, but his face was expressionless, like he was no longer there. I tried to wake him, shake him, but it was no use. Whatever had happened to him out there in the woods had taken him away from me. And the last thing I remember, before everything went black, was hearing Jake's voice one last time, soft and distant. "Help me."
Next story.
I had never been a fan of camping, but when my friends invited me to join them for a weekend in the woods, I couldn't find a good enough excuse not to go. They assured me it would be a relaxing trip, a chance to disconnect from our hectic lives and just enjoy nature. I've never been an outdoors person, but the idea of getting away from the constant hum of city life was too tempting. We headed out on a Friday afternoon, and the campsite was located in a remote part of the forest, far enough from any town or city to make it feel like we were truly isolated. The drive there was beautiful. The trees stretched high, and the road wound in and out of valleys and hills. I could already feel the weight of my usual stress beginning to lift. We set up camp near a creek, its sound calming and constant in the background as we went about preparing our tents. I tried to help, but honestly, I wasn't much of a camper. Still, I was doing my best to fit in. We cracked open some beers and settled around the fire pit, chatting and laughing. The sun dipped behind the trees, and darkness quickly took over the sky. It was just the five of us, me, my best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Mark, and our two other friends, Alex and Ellie. Everyone was in a good mood, but I started to feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't anything that I could point to specifically, but there was this odd tension in the air, something off about the way the wind whispered through the trees. That night, as we sat around the fire, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped. The trees creaked and groaned in the gusts, and the fire flickered wildly, casting strange, distorted shadows. As we talked, I noticed Alex staring into the woods, his face pale, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite read. "You okay?" I asked him, trying to break the tension. He snapped his gaze back to us, his face flushed. Yeah, I'm fine," he said, though he didn't seem fine. After a few moments of awkward silence, Ellie, trying to lighten the mood, started telling a ghost story. It was one of those classic tales about a ghostly hitchhiker who vanishes into thin air when you look back. But as she was telling it, something strange happened. The fire suddenly went out, plunging us into complete darkness. We all froze, eyes wide, listening as the crackling of the fire stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Anyone else hear that?" Mark asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. We all strained our ears, listening. There was something. It sounded like footsteps, deep, slow, deliberate steps. Not the kind an animal would make. These were too heavy, too rhythmic. My heart raced, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. "Probably just an animal," Sarah suggested, but her voice trembled a little. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were coming closer, then suddenly they stopped, right at the edge of the campsite. "I'm going to check it out," Alex said, standing up suddenly. "I'll be right back." Before anyone could protest, he grabbed a flashlight and walked into the darkness, his light cutting a small, weak path in front of him. We all watched, waiting, but nothing happened. He didn't call out, didn't make a sound. A few minutes passed, and then he was back, his face ashen, his eyes wide in panic. "There's someone out there," he whispered, out of breath. "I saw something." None of us spoke for a long time. We just sat there, the weight of his words hanging heavily between us. But what terrified me the most was the look on his face. He wasn't joking. He wasn't playing a prank. "What did you see?" I finally asked, my voice shaky. "I don't know. It was just standing there like it was waiting for me to look away. I saw its eyes," Alex muttered, his voice barely audible. "They were too bright, like they were glowing." We didn't know what to say to that. It felt like he had just shared a nightmare, and none of us had the words to respond. The wind howled louder now, and the trees creaked with every gust. "Let's just get inside the tents," Mark suggested. "If it's an animal, we're safe inside." We all agreed and scrambled to our tents. My heart was still pounding as I zipped up my tent and tried to calm myself. Didn't help. I lay there in the dark, listening to every creak, every rustle of leaves. I kept my flashlight next to me, ready to turn it on at the slightest sound. But it wasn't an animal. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud banging sound. It came from outside my tent, heavy and persistent. My first thought was that it was someone playing a prank, but then I remembered Alex's face. He wasn't joking. I held my breath and listened. The sound didn't stop. It was like something was hitting the ground repeatedly, dragging its hands or claws across the dirt. "Is anyone awake?" I whispered into the darkness. No response. I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peeked out. The moonlight barely lit the forest floor, but I saw a figure. It wasn't standing still. It was pacing, slowly, dragging its feet along the dirt. I couldn't see its face, but I could see its silhouette. A tall, hunched shape moving in unnatural ways. Its arms were too long, and the way it moved made my skin crawl. I quickly zipped the tent shut again, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure if I was breathing at all. The banging continued, getting louder and closer, like it was moving around the perimeter of our campsite. I lay frozen, clutching my sleeping bag tightly. It felt like hours passed, but finally the sound stopped. The silence was unbearable. I didn't dare peek out again, too afraid of what I might see. When dawn finally broke, I could hardly bring myself to step out of the tent. The others had all been awake for a while, looking equally shaken. None of us spoke much that morning. We packed up quickly, trying to leave as soon as possible. There were no more sounds from the woods, but the feeling of being watched never left. As we left the campsite and made our way back to the car, I glanced at the tree line one last time, and for a moment, just a split second, I saw something. A figure, barely visible through the trees. Its eyes glowed in the dim light. I didn't say anything to the others. They didn't need to know. I think we all knew by then that whatever it was, it had been watching us, and it was still there, deep in those woods, waiting for the next group of campers. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear the sound of footsteps outside my window. I don't know if I'm just imagining it or if it's something else, something that followed me back.
Next story.
It was just supposed to be a quiet weekend. I had rented a cabin in the woods, isolated, remote, with nothing but the sound of the trees and the occasional wildlife. I needed a break, a moment of solitude to clear my head, a chance to reset. The city was too loud, too chaotic, and I'd heard about this place from a friend who said it was perfect for getting away from everything. Little did I know that the quiet I was searching for would come at a terrifying cost. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the trees. It looked like something out of a postcard, small, rustic, surrounded by thick forest with a tiny creek running behind it. Everything seemed perfect. I stepped inside and was immediately greeted by the scent of old wood and fresh air. The cabin was modest, with a stone fireplace, a few old chairs, and a bed covered in a worn patchwork quilt. Nothing extravagant, but cozy. It felt safe. That night, after I made a simple dinner and settled in by the fire, I felt the weight of the silence. It was almost too much. There were no sounds of cars or people, no streetlights, no humming of distant machines, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I thought it would be calming, but it started to gnaw at me. I decided to take a walk to shake off the unease. I grabbed a flashlight, bundled up in my jacket, and stepped outside. The air was cold, but crisp, refreshing in a way. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. As I walked along the narrow trail behind the cabin, I tried to relax, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, or some other creature. But then I realized it was standing upright, its body hunched in an unnatural way. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was just on the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind the trees. It was tall, but too tall. Its limbs were impossibly long, stretching in ways that made no sense. And it wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, some shadow cast by the trees. But the longer I stared, the more real it seemed. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and backed away slowly, my feet making soft, crunching sounds on the leaves. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it wasn't something I wanted to get close to. I turned and rushed back to the cabin, locking the door behind me as soon as I was inside. The next few hours passed in a blur of anxiety. I kept hearing noises outside, branches snapping, something moving just beyond the walls. But when I checked, there was nothing. No creature, no figure, just the quiet, unnerving night. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was just the isolation getting to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I stayed up late, too afraid to sleep, my eyes darting between the dark corners of the room. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind that rattled the cabin sent a jolt of fear through me. Finally, I managed to fall asleep, but it wasn't peaceful. The nightmares came fast, vivid, and terrifying. I dreamt that I was walking through the woods again. This time, there was no flashlight. The trees closed in around me, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, following me. I couldn't turn around. My legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. I could feel the presence behind me, the weight of it bearing down on my back. And then, just as I was about to turn, I woke up with a start. The sun had barely risen, and I was already wide awake, drenched in sweat. I had to get out. I had to leave. I grabbed my things quickly, not even bothering to make coffee. The panic was settling in, making my hands shake. I stepped outside, hoping to breathe in the fresh morning air and clear my head. But the woods felt different now. Darker. The trees seemed to loom over me, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers. I heard the sound again, the rustling in the leaves, soft at first, almost like wind, but then a voice, a whisper. It was faint but unmistakable. My name. Come closer, it said, each word dragging through the air like a cold wind. I froze, my body going rigid. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Come closer, it repeated, and this time I could hear the rustle of feet moving toward me. The voice was unnatural, guttural, like something that didn't belong in the woods. I bolted, running back toward the cabin, my heart pounding in my ears. But when I reached the door, it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door was stuck, as though something on the other side was pressing against it, holding it shut. I yanked harder, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Come closer. I spun around, looking for somewhere to hide. That's when I saw it, the thing that had been following me. It wasn't human. It was something else. It had no face, just a smooth, pale surface where its eyes and mouth should have been. Its arms were long, skeletal, and its body was thin and contorted. It wasn't walking, it was gliding toward me like it was moving through the air itself. "Come closer," it whispered again. I could feel my legs shaking, my body frozen with terror. I knew I had to get away, but I couldn't move. Every instinct told me to run, but my feet wouldn't respond. It was like my body was paralyzed, caught in the grip of something far worse than fear. And then, just as the thing reached the cabin, everything went silent. The door that had been stuck just moments before swung open with ease. I don't know how it happened, but it felt like a release. I didn't stop to think. I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't care about anything else. I made it to the car, tearing down the dirt road with my heart in my throat. When I finally reached the main highway, I couldn't stop shaking. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't tell anyone what happened. But every time I'm alone in the woods, I can still hear that whisper. "Come closer." And I know, whatever it was, whatever I saw that day, is still out there, waiting.
Next story.
I had never been the outdoorsy type, but my friends talked me into a weekend camping trip upstate. It was supposed to be a getaway, just a few days of hiking, grilling marshmallows, and telling stories around a campfire. But something happened out there. Something that has haunted me ever since. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, a secluded area in the woods, far from any roads or other campers. The trees stood tall and dense, their thick branches blotting out the sky. My friends, Sarah, Jake, and Kevin, all seemed excited as we unloaded our gear. I wasn't entirely sure why they were so eager. There was something about the place that felt off to me, but I didn't say anything. I figured I was just overthinking it. After all, this was supposed to be fun, right? By the time the fire was lit, the sun had disappeared, leaving behind a thick blanket of darkness. The flames from the fire crackled and popped, sending glowing embers up into the night air. We sat around it, roasting marshmallows, laughing, and telling stories. I was trying to relax, but the eerie silence of the forest kept gnawing at the back of my mind. The woods were too quiet, and the trees felt too close, like they were watching us. It was Jake who first brought up the subject of ghosts. He had a knack for turning everything into a scary story. "You know," he said, leaning in toward the fire, "I heard that this forest is haunted. People say there's something out there, something that doesn't want you here." Sarah laughed nervously, but Kevin didn't seem to think it was funny. "What kind of something?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my stomach had already started to churn. "I don't know," Jake shrugged. "Just people who got lost in these woods, you know? People who've been here and never came back. The old park ranger said he heard whispers in the trees. Some say it's the spirits of those who didn't make it out." That was enough for me. I wanted to laugh it off, but the thought lingered, and the darkness of the forest seemed to close in around us. We eventually called it a night, crawling into our tents to sleep. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The air in the tent felt thick, as if something was pressing against the walls. Every little noise outside made me jump. The wind, the creaking of the trees, and the occasional snap of a twig, it all seemed so unnatural. I must have finally drifted off because I woke up to the sound of movement outside the tent, soft and slow, like someone or something was creeping around the perimeter. I froze, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was just outside, almost like breathing. Then I heard a low, guttural whisper. It was a voice, but I couldn't make out the words. Panic flooded my body. I reached over to wake Jake, but as I turned, I realized he was gone. My stomach dropped. I had seen him crawl into his tent just hours earlier, but now, nothing. The tent was empty. I scrambled to get out of mine, my hands shaking, and that's when I heard it. A rustling from the woods, something large moving quickly between the trees. My mind raced, my pulse thundering in my ears. I stumbled outside, hoping to find Jake, or at least someone. The fire was now just a dying heap of glowing embers, casting a dim, orange glow over the camp. The tents stood eerily still in the night air, but there was no sign of my friends. I called out, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the forest. That's when I noticed it. Footprints in the dirt, leading away from the campfire. I followed them, my breath shallow with fear. The tracks were deep, as if something heavy had walked through. The direction they led seemed to curve toward the dense part of the woods, where the trees grew thick and tangled. I kept walking, too terrified to turn back. The deeper I went, the more disorienting the forest became. The trees felt like they were closing in, their branches reaching down like clawed hands, brushing against my skin. I could hear my breath quickening and the sound of my heartbeat pulsing in my ears. And then I saw it. A figure standing between the trees. At first I thought it was one of my friends, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. The shape was too still, too unnatural. It was a shadow, blacker than the night around it. It didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there watching. I was frozen in place, unable to move or even scream. The figure didn't seem human. It was too tall, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching out like branches. Its face was obscured by a tattered hood, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and malicious. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Then it stepped forward, the ground beneath its feet crunching, and the air grew colder, much colder, like ice was forming in the air. My chest tightened, and I could barely breathe as it moved closer, the darkness around it seeming to swallow all light. I turned and bolted, running faster than I thought was possible, the sound of its footsteps echoing behind me. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran until my legs burned, until my chest felt like it was going to explode, but I didn't look back. I couldn't bring myself to. When I finally made it back to the campsite, I collapsed near the fire, gasping for air. My mind was racing, heart pounding in my chest, but all I could hear was silence. The woods were still as if nothing had happened, but when I looked around, my heart sank. There were no footprints leading back. There was no sign of anyone. The camp was as empty as it had been before. I don't know how much time passed, but it felt like hours before the sun began to rise. I found my way back to the tents, praying I would find my friends there. But they weren't. The tents were untouched, their flaps still closed. The forest around me was silent, as if it had swallowed them whole. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up what little I could, and I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away from that place, away from the thing that haunted those woods. I've tried to forget what happened, but I can't. Every night I hear those whispers again, the ones from the woods, and every time I close my eyes, I see the figure standing in the trees, waiting. It still watches me, I know it does.
Next story.
It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, a weekend camping trip in the woods with a couple of old friends from college. We had all agreed it would be the ideal way to relax, get away from the stress of daily life, and reconnect with nature. The location was remote, the kind of place that promises solitude. We found a small, secluded campsite near an old, dried-up riverbed, surrounded by dense trees and jagged rocks. It was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. We spent the first day hiking, laughing, and cooking our meals over the fire. As nightfall approached, we set up our tents in a circle, built the campfire higher, and settled in for some ghost stories. We joked about the typical campfire spooks, stories about killers lurking in the woods, spirits haunting old cabins, and creatures that only came out after dark. None of us believed in that stuff, of course. We were all in our late 20s, too old to be scared by campfire tales. Or so we thought. The first strange thing happened after dark. We were sitting around the fire when we heard what sounded like footsteps. Soft, almost like someone was walking through the dry leaves. But when we looked into the woods, there was nothing there. The rest of us shrugged it off. It was probably a deer or some other animal. But as the night went on, the sounds became more frequent, more deliberate. First the footsteps, then something else. Rustling, scratching, like claws scraping against bark. My friends were getting uncomfortable, but no one wanted to be the one to say anything. We kept talking, trying to laugh it off, but that gnawing feeling of unease started to settle in my stomach. I noticed that no one else seemed to hear it, or at least no one was acknowledging it. At some point, we all went to bed. I didn't sleep well, though. I kept hearing the sounds, those soft footsteps, the rustling, the scratching, but this time they were louder, closer. I felt like someone was standing just outside my tent, watching me. When morning came, we were all a little shaken, but no one mentioned it. We ate breakfast, packed up our things, and decided to head out for another hike. But as we were walking along the trail, we started to notice something odd. The trees were strange. Some of them had deep, unnatural gashes along the trunks, like something had clawed them. The underbrush was unnaturally quiet, and the birds had stopped chirping. We walked in silence, the only sound being our footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath us. And then we saw it. At first, it looked like a tree stump, but as we got closer, we realized it was much too smooth, too rounded. It was a human-like shape, but the features were wrong, disfigured, twisted. It looked like a body, half buried in the dirt, with branches twisted around it like fingers. My stomach dropped. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my eyes locked on the thing, unable to look away. And then I noticed something else. The air had gone still, too still. No breeze, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence. That's when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of a voice, but not in any language I knew. It was a low, guttural growl, almost like someone was choking on their own words, and it was coming from the woods around us. Panic set in. We turned to run, but the woods felt different now. The trees seemed to shift, blocking our way, guiding us deeper into the forest. I could hear the growling following us, getting louder, closer. My friends were yelling, but I couldn't make sense of their words. I just kept running, stumbling over roots and rocks, desperate to escape whatever was following us. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to stretch, bend, as though the woods were playing tricks on us. Finally, we emerged from the trees, breathless, covered in sweat and dirt, our hearts racing. But we weren't safe. The air outside the forest was thick with the smell of decay, like something was rotting just out of sight. And standing at the edge of the woods, in the clearing where our campsite had been, was a figure. A man. At least I think it was a man. His face was hidden in shadow, but his outline was unmistakable, tall, gaunt, and unnaturally thin. His limbs were long, too long, and his body seemed to sway as if it didn't quite belong in the world. We tried to run again, but this time the figure moved, slowly, unhurried. The growling, that horrible, inhuman growl, echoed in the distance. It sounded like it was coming from the figure itself. It wasn't a man. It couldn't be. I was the first to break. I pushed my friends aside, running with everything I had. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I don't know how I made it out of those woods alive, but I did. When I reached the parking lot, I collapsed into my car and drove away without a second thought. I didn't even care to check if my friends made it out. I just wanted to leave. A week later, I got a call from one of my friends. She had gone back to the forest, thinking maybe it was all in our heads, a product of too much fear. But when she returned, she said the trees had changed. The stump we saw wasn't there anymore, and the forest seemed different, as though it had never existed at all. I didn't go back. I've never gone back. But sometimes, when the night is too quiet, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear that growl. And I know, whatever it was, whatever we encountered in those woods is still out there waiting for the next group of fools to wander too far into its territory.